Well, good afternoon and welcome to the second edition of From Brussels with Power, the joint webinar series of EUGINE and EUTurbines for the members. My name is Ralf Wetzel, and together with my colleague Gaetan, we will today not talk about cows, so apologies for those who misunderstood our webinar title, but about methane emissions. Why we nevertheless called it "It's not all about the cows," you will get the explanation within the next minutes. For those of you joining for the first time, the idea of the webinar series is to take a Brussels topic and connect it to your business and your companies. From the registrations, we know that there are quite some experts among the participants today that know by far more about methane itself than Gaetan and me. To clarify expectations, we will not tell you anything new with regard to methane or gas combustion or concrete values. This is part of our expert group meetings, which we will have over the next days and weeks. Instead, our target for today is that after 30 minutes, hopefully everybody understood what is driving the EU legislators at this moment with regard to this topic and why this is now relevant for you. Your questions are most welcome. We will pick them up at the end of the session. There is a possibility for putting forward your questions in a Q&A box. And in case you do not see the box already on the right side of the screen, please look at this picture, which tells you how to open the Q&A box. So please do use it. We, of course, appreciate if you add your name and company to the question. The session will be recorded and it will be available for members only afterwards. You will not be visible, but when answering the questions, we might mention your name. So we assume you agree to this. And in case you don't, then simply don't put in your name when you write down the question. And of course, as always, at our events, the rules of EUTurbines and EUGINE regarding compliance apply. So with that, let's get started. So why is it not all about the cows? The EU target that you can read in the Green Deal, in the EU climate law, and all the statements that you hear is climate neutrality by 2050. It is climate neutrality, not CO2 neutrality. And it's climate neutrality not only for the energy sector, but the whole economy. As you all know, there are other greenhouse gases than CO2 causing climate change, and methane is considered as the second most important and damaging. It has a much shorter atmospheric lifetime than CO2, around 5 years, but it is a much more potent greenhouse gas. And after years where scientists and activists were primarily focusing on CO2, since a few years, they highlight more and more the importance of methane. And looking at the emitters, the agricultural sector is the biggest source, followed by energy-related emissions. And when the topic comes up in our energy sector, it's a very popular reaction to point the finger at the cows and highlight that they are the real problem. Why do we believe that this is not the suitable approach? Firstly, because looking at one sector does not make the institutions blind versus the other sector. And while it is true that the cows are a challenge, politicians also believe that it might be easier to tackle reductions in the energy sector than convincing the population to become vegetarians. The EU identified methane emissions in the energy sector as a low-hanging fruit in comparison with the livestock sector. This is simply what we need to acknowledge. And secondly, fossil fuels in the energy sector are already under fire when it comes to CO2. Of course, we explain altogether the advantages of gas power plants, that we can immediately cut CO2 emissions in half compared to coal, that we are flexible, reliable, and so on. And since some time we add that these plants will be able to switch to decarbonized and renewable gases, so not emitting any CO2 when they've switched over. But there are strong voices in Brussels and in other places that demand a phase out of all fossil fuels, not only coal. And there's also an influential stream in Brussels claiming that the system can easily do without any gas power generation. And for them, methane is another strong argument to underline that view. If we want gas power generation to play the role that we promote, then we must not only have a credible approach to CO2, but also to methane. And the benchmark will not be, to be very clear, that we prove that methane emissions from gas are lower than from coal. We need to demonstrate that we can meet the EU ambitions regarding climate neutrality, including methane. We will have to do that for the transitional period, and that's already a period that is running for natural gas, and later on for decarbonized and renewable gas. And if you believe that this is a topic of the future, here are two very concrete areas existing already today. Over the past 2 years, we had CO2 limits coming in at EU level. First, in the rules for capacity mechanisms on the electricity market. Later on in the European Investment Bank lending policy, and also at the classification of sustainable investments under the heading taxonomy. And while this has been a question first of CO2 emissions, this is now step by step widening to limits referring to CO2 equivalent, which means nothing else but including methane. This is becoming the new normal, limits including methane emissions. And the second point, already in 2018, in an EU regulation about the energy union, it was included and fixed that the EU would define a strategy focused on methane emissions specifically for the energy sector. This is what now again showed up in the Green Deal recently, and that means really focused on the energy sector. Now the EU is working on specific rules on methane emission. So the topic will not go away by pointing at the cows. It will also not go away by saying that our turbines and engines are contributing only to an extent that is negligible. It will either go away by having gas power generation completely excluded from the energy mix in the medium to long term, or by a joint effort of the whole gas chain together with the well-minded legislators to dramatically reduce methane emissions in the energy sector. And my colleague Gaëtan will now look at the status that we have today.
Thank you, Ralph. So before talking about the upcoming strategy of the European Commission, we should have a look at what has been done so far by the EU on one side and by the gas industry on the other side to reduce methane emissions. Methane is not a new topic. The first communication of the European Commission on methane emissions dates back to 1996. At that time, the focus was on methane emissions from waste and landfills. In the meantime, methane has appeared in few overarching EU legislation pieces. Power plants with a total rated thermal input exceeding 20 megawatts are concerned because they are covered by the EU carbon market, the so-called emission trading scheme, the ETS. It means operators of such power plants above 20 megawatt must buy allowances for all greenhouse gases emitted by their plant, including CO2, but also CH4. Outside of power generation, other sectors such as agriculture or transport have also to reduce methane emissions, in line with the so-called effort sharing regulation. Concerning power plants with a total rated thermal input exceeding 50 megawatts, so a bit bigger ones, some requirements are defined in the large combustion plants BREF, where limits are set to control the emissions of larger power plants. The conclusion number 45 of the best available techniques deals specifically with methane emissions of larger gas engines. It requires optimized combustions and/or the use of oxidation catalyst. And it provides as well emission limits for methane for both existing and new gas engines power plants. In parallel, there are no specific requirements for gas turbines. Some more focused legislation pieces are looking at other kinds of pollutants, but not at methane emissions. If we talk about the Methane Combustion Plant Directive, there is no threshold in it for methane emissions. As you know, the Medium Combustion Plants Directive is for the other kinds of power plants below the 50 megawatts total rated input. For them, there is no specific requirement. Furthermore, so far, there is no legislation specifically dedicated to reducing methane emissions along the whole gas value chain. For example, there are no concrete requirements for gas production or gas transport. So as we saw, there are already some steps which have been done by the EU, but not everything is regulated so far. But on a global level, the gas and oil industry has been working on the topic of methane emissions for a while. This takes place in different initiatives. Many of them are voluntary ones, and a lot has already been done in the last decades and especially in the last years to both better assess methane emissions in terms of quantity, location, and cost, but also to reduce methane emissions. And since 1990, methane emissions in Europe are going down by it's minus 38%, while gas consumption is going up plus 25%. To increase cooperation and reduce methane emissions, a number of public or public-private or private initiatives have been set up, such as the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, the Global Methane Initiatives, and the Methane Guiding Principles. So many initiatives and already some progress done. Even if all parts of the gas value chain are affected by methane emissions, some parts have been more under scrutiny. Data from the European Environment Agency from 2016 show where most of emissions are coming from. As end users such as gas power plants are not part of this study, the data show where outside our sector the biggest problems are. And what we see is that gas transmission and storage represent around 1/4 of emissions, while gas distribution represents even more than half of the emissions, 59%. So gas TSOs and especially gas DSOs are at the forefront of the methane discussion. It means also that gas compressors driven by gas turbines or gas engine technology and installed by gas network operators are naturally also under the spotlight. But does this spotlight on gas TSOs and DSOs mean that it is not a problem, that it is only a problem of the oil and gas industry and we can leave it there? No. And Ralph will now tell us that it's not only about pipeline and natural gas, and this has important consequences for our industry.
Yeah, thank you, Gaetan. When talking about methane emissions in the supply chain, it is, of course, of relevance to differentiate. And that's also what institutions and the lobbyists do. European gas, coming mainly from the North Sea via pipelines, has the lowest emissions and is controlled by the EU. Gas coming from Algeria or Russia has higher emissions and less possibilities of the EU to control and limit methane leakage. Also, what is obvious, methane emissions increase with the length of transport. Another thing that studies also show is that the transport as LNG always leads to higher emissions compared to pipeline transport. And the highest emissions are connected to unconventional gas, so fracking gas, where production is causing the largest share of methane emissions, while, as Gaetan explained, for the other ones, it is transport and distribution that has the largest share of methane leakage. So the worst combination is unconventional gas being transported over a long distance as LNG. And in the political discussion, this will play an important role. But for us, it may be even more important that the current debate is not limited to natural gas, which is, as I mentioned, seen as a transitional solution, but it also concerns other gases potentially causing methane emissions. Biogas is composed of around 60% of methane, and biomethane itself has even 98% methane content. There's, just to mention it, at the moment, a project running to evaluate methane emissions of different European biogas plants concepts to see and go deeper into the differences. Well, it's obvious synthetic methane is, of course, also methane. And finally, it needs to be mentioned that decarbonized hydrogen has also a link to methane. The blue decarbonized hydrogen from steam reforming and CCS, as well as the quite new turquoise hydrogen, which is the one from pyrolysis, they are all based on natural gas and therefore methane. It means that the simple argumentation that with a switch from natural gas to decarbonized and renewable gases, that we would also get rid of the methane problem, it's not that simple. If, according to the study mentioned before, roughly 80% of the emissions are attributed to transmission and distribution, we have a challenge to solve also with the other renewable and decarbonized gases, all but green hydrogen. Both points, the different categories of natural gas, as well as methane and decarbonized and renewable gases, are relevant for our internal discussions about the best fuel for the future. So some members expressed a certain preference for synthetic methane or biomethane over green hydrogen. If we go that route, we need to be very clear in the approach with regard to methane emissions. Otherwise, legislators will not regard this as a possible path. Also, the idea of non-renewable hydrogen needs to go along with a clear analysis of the emission impact regarding methane. Not giving an answer here would undermine the credibility of our industry approach to ensure the climate neutral power generation with gas by 2050, the latest. Now, Gaetan continues.
Yes. So coming back to the work which has been done so far, it is perceived, the work done by the gas industry and the European Commission, as a good but insufficient first step by NGOs, which now require and ask for more steps towards methane emission reduction. For example, the Environmental Defense Fund, which is one of the key drivers in the discussion from the NGO side, it increases the pressure on the gas sector by threatening to use infrared cameras mounted on robots or drones, or even to make measurements by satellites to discover hidden big emitters of methane. The Environmental Defense Fund recently even said that oil and gas companies should commit by the end of the year to emission reduction targets for 2025 and 2030. Otherwise, they will be under pressure of investors and society. The same NGOs are putting pressure on the European Commission, which now intends to take strong measures to reduce emissions. This includes all kinds of methane emissions, meaning firstly fugitive emissions, meaning leaks, but also venting, the intentional releases often for safety reasons, which are due to how the facility is designed or operated, but also the flaring, the incomplete combustion when natural gas, which cannot be used or recovered economically, is burned. All these different kinds of methane emissions must be reduced. The European Commission's strategy should cover the gas, oil and coal sectors, all of which emit methane. And it should cover those from production to consumptions. For the first time, end users are part of the discussions, so our sector is fully integrated in this discussion. So what will be the next steps concretely? In May, so in a few weeks, there will be the publication of the European Commission's strategy, explaining the objectives and intentions of the European Commission. But it's only a first step. On the 10th of June, there will be a workshop between the European Commission and stakeholders to discuss the preliminary results of a study commissioned by the European Commission on limiting methane emissions in the energy sector. The study should provide information on measurement and reporting methodologies, as well as policy recommendations for minimizing methane emissions along the gas value chain. And the study should be published in August. And then the Commission will further work on a legislative proposal coming in spring 2021. At that time, the Commission will make concrete proposals for requirements, probably to improve measurement, quantification, reporting and verification of emissions in the EU. Probably try to oblige the gas sector to repair leaks as much as possible and set standards in terms of methane emissions for each part of the gas value chain. This could lead, for example, to requirements in terms of emissions of gas imports, like maybe LNG. We talked about it. It's more under the focus of the Commission. And possibly define new, stricter requirements in terms of emissions of gas power plants, maybe through the MCPD or IED legislation pieces we talked about. Ralph will now tell us more about the concrete implications for our sector.
Thank you. So what is there to do for us as associations representing gas power generation technology? 1 year ago, the European Commission requested the whole gas sector, the European gas sector, to answer 4 questions regarding the status of emissions, running initiatives, plans of reduction, and so on. And at that time, a report was prepared by the relevant associations, including EUTurbines and EUGINE. And our sector kept a very low profile there on request of you, the members, with a very defensive approach, mainly declaring that the quantities are not relevant. And we did that mainly based on very general theoretical statements. No measured data was provided. And it's very obvious that this will not be enough for gaining trust or avoiding further legislative steps in the future. The use in power generation in the future will not be viewed disconnected from the supply chain. That has to be very clear to us. The future of gas power generation depends on the overall climate gas performance of the kilowatt hour of electricity or heat produced. So all the emissions from the drilling of gas via transport, storage, and the use will be added up to evaluate the future of gas power generation. Remember the limits on CO2 equivalent in the taxonomy report, which refer to the entire value chain, which means nothing else but that we need to actively work with the gas sector, the whole gas sector, in drastically reducing methane leakage along the supply chain for natural gas and all the other gases. And just to quote an official European Commission document, as little as 3% leakage of methane along the natural gas supply chain can put into question the lower emissions of gas versus coal in power generation, which is in generally expected to halve greenhouse gas emissions when gas is substituted for coal. So 3% in their argumentation, and that comes from an IEA document, 3% of leakage in the supply chain means gas is no more better than coal. And if you read that document, it continues, and I think that is also important to say, the aim of any assessment and action should not so much be to prove that gas is better than coal, but rather to narrow the emission gap as much as possible between gas and carbon neutral energy sources. So this is our comparison, the carbon neutral energy sources, not the coal anymore. And second point, so first we need to work with the gas sector. Secondly, we need to do our own homework. The legislation that will come will probably require also the end users of gas to report their exact emissions and show approaches how to reduce them. Not talking at all yet about setting any limit values. And we must be perceived as a proactive partner to the EU and provide reliable measured data and not theoretical calculations and a clear plan on reductions. If we directly, even if the directly emitted quantities may be limited, we need to prove that. To say it again, finally, this will not go away by pointing at cows and stating that our quantities are low. And the thought of using the topic to better differentiate between turbines and engines is, in my eyes, as being in charge of both associations, also very short-sighted. This is about the future of gas power generation in general. We need to work hard to show a high ambition, and we need to do this from now on, because as Gaetan showed you, in May we will get the roadmap and legislation next year, so definitely no time to lose. So that's what we prepared from our side. We do have received a few questions which we would like to pick up. So my apologies if I look to the side and read the questions. One by Max is about national level legislation on the gas value chain. I have to admit I don't have the complete overview. I know that in some countries this is ongoing, like in Germany there's some serious effort going on to look at the methane, and we can try to provide you with an overview when talking to the gas sister associations. Another question from Max was on the source of information regarding the different means of transportation that I mentioned. Again, this is a German study of the Federal Agency for the Environment. I can check if it's available in English. Otherwise, happy to provide it in German or translate the critical parts. Then there's a question by Enrico, which is about explaining that we, as gas power generation, provide something necessary for the future system. I think this is what we spend most of our time and activities on in Brussels, to really do this. Really, yes, that's absolutely essential. But yeah, it will not be enough to do that. We need to do that, but we need to have the answers on how do we become climate neutral. Then one more question, is the EC study on methane emissions run by politicians or by technicians? Gaetan, you want to
answer on that? Yes, so it was commissioned by the Commission, and now it's it's 4 different consultancies, TNO, Wood, and 2 others, which are now taking care of the work. There are no real experts of the topic. I mean, they have some expertise, but not they have not worked for years on the topic, and that's why we can provide input, we can provide ideas, and this is what we intend to do also in the coming weeks, to give them more information about the specificities of our sector. But we have also a bit to wait and to see to what extent, what are their expectations and focus before providing the appropriate message.
Thank you, Gaetan. Then there was a question about why is this happening now all of a sudden, that methane emissions become such a top priority. Why exactly now? I think we tried to answer that already before. It's in this piece of legislation that you have that I mentioned on the Energy Union, which was now picked up. So it's a to-do since 2018. And also maybe it's important to mention that the Commission regards natural gas as a transitional solution. And that means they don't want to talk about it in 20 years when it comes to methane. They want to regulate it now for the period that they see natural gas to still play a role. But again, I would like to also underline that we need to think about the other gases as well, because those are the gases of the future. And the methane challenge for some of them is remaining when it comes to transport and distribution. And the last question is about the 10th of June EU workshop. Who represents our industry? Gaetan, you want to pick this up?
So we have not received invitation so far. I think it was originally thought to be a physical meeting and will be probably a virtual meeting. I guess many people will be able to participate on the internet. We will send you all the details so that you can participate when we know more about the details. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaetan. Those were the questions that we've seen that you put in the Q&A box. We're, of course, happy to answer questions also after this webinar. And just to tell you, we will have dedicated task force meetings in EUTurbines and in EUGINE. In EUGINE, that's already next week, to go and dive deeper into the topic. And as we are now 5 minutes already after our foreseen 30 minutes, I guess it's time to end the webinar. We hope you found the time listening to us worth it, and that you will again join us in 2 weeks when we do the next webinar. This one will be about the Green Deal in times of COVID-19. It will explain, of course, the Green Deal, but it will also look at the growing discussion of connecting economic recovery programs to the targets of the Green Deal. So Wednesday in 2 weeks, again at 2 o'clock, and already one step further, 2 weeks after that, we will look into another very tricky topic, which is the colors of hydrogen and their impact on us. So all the discussions about green, blue, pink, turquoise hydrogen, that's going to take place in 4 weeks. So next one in 2 weeks, Wednesday at 2. Thank you all for joining us. Stay safe and take care. Bye-bye.